Click on what thing? Uh,
Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us once again as we have time to put a little bit of our day together and talking about the work of an evangelist. We've got Terry back from the secret hidden bunker or wherever it was he was hiding out for the last couple of weeks. Terry, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, and it's good to be back. I told you today earlier. You said, "Are you ready to do this?" And I said, "I guess." I don't know if I remember how. It's been so long, but it's good to be back and to kind of get into some discussions today.
One of the things that we're going to do in the course of our broadcasts going forward, just like we've done in the past, is to continually touch on things that are really important for evangelists as they step into the work. Um, there are certain things that are kind of easy to categorize as, yeah, this is obviously the work of a preacher. Sermons, Bible classes, home Bible studies, conversations about the word, those are all like, yeah, I got it. Those are definitely in the work. And then there are layers of things that begin to mingle into personal parts of this is what a Christian does, and you may not do them structurally or formally as an evangelist. And we're living somewhere in that middle gray area with our two primary subjects for today. And we're going to be talking about weddings and funerals. They really are something that I think in many ways are kind of shifting in the way in which folks approach them. The practice of weddings and the practice of funerals and the engagement of preachers in those things has kind of changed a little bit over the last couple of years. But we're going to talk about it in three ways: goals, approaches, and outcomes. I think that's a good way, at least for us, to format our perspective. And so, Terry, take a moment at least to kind of describe your experiences early on in your first year of preaching with weddings and funerals. And in a second, I'll layer on a couple of experiences there so we can get some frame of reference so people kind of know what we're talking about. So, weddings and funerals, year one, how did that go?
Well, in year one, like most guys, I think I was at a church that was smaller and older, and that meant that I did more funerals than weddings. And I think that's probably where a lot of people are. And then as you get older, I think I've done more weddings. Weddings usually ends up being either your family members or maybe the high school kids that you were influential on, and as they get older, they want you to do their wedding. So from that standpoint, it's interesting to kind of see that dynamic of how that happened. And at older congregations, there's a lot of funerals. So young guys kind of get thrown into, I think, sometimes, because especially in the South, there's this idea or mindset of the preacher does the funeral. Now, I will say for me, there was a couple of times that the old preacher got to do the funerals, and so I got to spectate, and that probably shaped some of my opinions on this about funerals and weddings, sometimes to the good and sometimes to the bad, maybe, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, for me, my first work is what Clark Duggar called an extended gospel meeting. And so I did a few funerals at that point, moved to Oregon, did a couple weddings, a couple funerals. And then when I got to Tennessee, the group there was going through a demographic transition where it was heavily aged when I got there. A lot of older couples, a lot of older families, some singles that were on up in years, wonderful people. But very quickly, in the course of 1 year, I did 13 funerals. Many of them came out of that congregation, some were from areas in the community, and that kind of continued as a touchstone in the lives of the Christians I was connected with. And so with that meant that very quickly, I had to figure out how to kind of navigate a very challenging and emotional context. Nobody's happy at a funeral. And if they're happy, that means that there's some real serious sinful issues that are kind of boiling under that are now being satisfied through a sense of revenge. And it's not genuine happiness. So on the first layer for a funeral, everybody's heartbroken. I've even done quite a few funerals for those who were not connected to the churches I was working with, often being called by the funeral home to come in and do a funeral. And I would get there and it would be the staff, me, no family, and one or two of the brethren who were able to come because they knew I was engaging in a funeral for someone who had nobody. And so those are really challenging in different ways, but they help us kind of formulate some goals for funerals. Weddings and funerals actually have some very similar goals. I'll throw a couple of them out there and we can talk about how we can achieve them. One of the goals of the funeral or the wedding is to set the door for a second conversation. We're not going to see people, I say we're not, but someone's going to say, well, there's this one time. But generally speaking, you're not going to see someone being baptized during the wedding. And you're not going to see someone being baptized. And I'm using baptized as the metaphor for entire conversion during those settings. So you're trying to set up a secondary conversation. Like you want a next level interaction from that. So one of your goals is to start that. Terry, for your preparation process, how do you think through getting to that second level of conversation?
Well, so let me say this. I was telling you this earlier that there is sometimes I think sometimes people take an approach to funerals, especially of this is my way to hammer a family of fallen away folks,
Yeah.
and kind of beat them into submission to the Lord. And I will tell you, if you take that approach, you're probably not going to get them back because grieving people aren't in the mood to be beaten into submission for the Lord. So one of the things that I'm very careful about is funerals are for the living. And so we have to ask ourselves, what does the living want in regards to that?
Right.
I often have a meeting with the family, and you talk about preparation, sit down and meet with the family, whether I know them or not, and ask what they want this service to look like. You know, they have a role in directing that. There are times where I've had a meeting with the family and they're so consumed with grief, they don't know. And one of those times that sticks out is a time a couple years ago where a very close friend of mine, they had a baby that was stillborn. And it was the only time I've had to do a funeral of an infant, which, by the way, is a whole nother level of anxiety. And I'm not sure that I did a good job at that, you know. In preparation for that, one of the things I made sure that is, because in that situation, it would be very out of place to hammer home salvation. And I got to tell you, if there was ever an opportunity to preach somebody into heaven, it's a stillborn infant, and to use those terms. And, you know, that funeral looked very different from any other funeral that I've ever done. So in preparation, I look at what the family wants. I look at what the family needs. And even if that's salvation, what I really want them to see a lot of times is lay some kind of groundwork for a second interaction where they will realize, not immediately, but maybe in the weeks to come, that if their life is out of sorts, that their passed away loved one wants it to be in order, and to give them an opportunity to do that. So when you talk about preparation, I think the family interaction goes a long way in that. And by the way, let me say this about the family interaction in regards to that. Make sure that you give the family the opportunity to be a part and do what they feel they need to do. I've heard of people before that didn't want certain things to go on. Maybe it was the reading of a letter they didn't want to read. Maybe it was one of the family members speaking they didn't want to speak. That's their opportunity to grieve, and you got to let them do that, by the way. And all that plays into this part, I think, what we're talking about of having this opportunity. if I shut down everything and I control and I do this in a way and I go, no, I'm going to do the funeral the way I want to do this, I'm not going to have any opportunity. So I guess that's one of the big things for me is making sure the family's needs are met, in that sense, if that makes sense. I don't know if that's what you're going for, but that's kind of what my mind's
Well, that's part of the equation. I lay out some things for myself that are really important in the same area. One of the things I remember is that there's no perfect way to tell somebody about their own pain. And so
Yeah.
when I go to talk to them, I get up to speak, I understand my own limitations. I can empathize, I can sympathize. I've done the funeral for my mom. That gives me a different perspective than other folks. I've been on both sides of the table, if you will. So on the preparation side, I remember that. No perfect way. But there are things that have to be said about our perfect King. And so both in my dialogues beforehand and in the sermon and in the conversation, because I'm going to be talking to folks leading up to and going away from them, I'm trying to help them see Christ in my interactions. And so I'm trying to be a demonstrative kind of illustration of all of this. So I want to make sure they know that I care and the care is real and it's genuine. And then I'll move through and try to figure out how do I balance the goodness and severity of God, because those are the things, the two themes that come up in a sermon. There's no way to hide sorrow at a funeral, so you don't. You have to grapple with it and deal with it. And so once you've grappled with sorrow, you have to throw joy into the mix. And so if I know the person, I will tell the funniest stories that I can possibly imagine, designed to connect to a spiritual truth. So if I can remember something about my interactions with them that will just make me fall on the side and laugh, it's going to be appearing in that funeral message, especially if it's involving that core goal, goodness and severity of God. If I can connect that in some way. So when they go home, they take that with them. They remember their loved one. And when they remember their loved one, they're thinking about the things that matter. Because that's usually kind of the methodology that I kind of pull into is, all right, I'm trying to get to this, lay out this goal of remembering, this goal of expecting from the funeral side. Now, if we flip the table and we go to the wedding side, while the goals are kind of similar, the methodology is different because just like Ecclesiastes tells us, the Koheleth tells us there in the song or in Ecclesiastes, he goes, it's better to go to a house of mourning, but we still go to houses of feasting. We feel different there. So I can't bring sorrow as an emotion to lever because joy is the emotion. And so we're talking about different things there. With wedding talk, sometimes we get keyed into the criteria for a suitable mate in the sense of can they marry, and we don't spend time on should they marry, and why are these two being married. And so over the years and I'll admittedly, I kind of shy away from weddings. I've levered from can they marry to should and why these two. And so that's kind of part of my methodology in my goal setting. I want people to listen to why should we marry and why are these two being married as much as anything else. Terry, you having a little problem with the audio there?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm breaking up as much as you are. Maybe just my connection. So I'm trying to figure out all of that. A little distracting. If I need to leave and reconnect, I will. So somebody can let us know.
Terry sounds like Darth Vader at this point.
Yeah, you do too. That's the problem. So I mean, I will fully acknowledge that I think my weddings are probably far less about or far less evangelistic opportunities probably than in most cases than the funerals, just because of what is appropriate and what is yeah. let me reconnect. I figured Hal let me know. Phil, you go solo for a minute, and I'll be right back.
Yeah, Terry, he's always leaving me. I don't know what to do with him. So, you think about those things in the effect of, and Terry's talking about evangelistic outcomes, evangelistic goals in a wedding setting. They're really more muted in that sense because you're serving in a capacity that connects to a family's beginning point. Your teaching outcomes there are actually going to be taking place probably in the counseling that takes place early to the wedding itself. At least for me, that's where I'm really drilling down into can you marry more so than should you and why these two. That kind of ties together my concept for it. So if I'm going to have 10 classes with a premarital counseling session or 5 classes with a premarital counseling session, the weight is going to start early on is can you into that valley of should you, and then we end up in the wedding of why these two. And so I kind of look at it as a package there. Although and one other thing I'll talk about specifically for those who preach is I intentionally limit who I am willing to serve as a marital officiant with. I've got a contract. It's arbitrarily hard to agree to. I designed it that way. And one of the things I put in there specifically is on the day of the wedding, I will not change anything unless the bride tells me. You know, and I will fight people on it because of reasons. We might get to those at the end. So that's kind of my methodology in the sense of what are my goals? My goals aren't to evangelize so much as they are to inform, educate, and encourage.
Can you hear me better?
You're 100% online.
Good.
Hal has a question for us.
Yeah, I just saw that. Do you do counseling for all weddings? I'm glad to offer, but I do not require. I'll answer that. I absolutely require that.
Yeah.
I don't have a contract they have to sign, but there's 2 basic requirements, and there's some other things that can be talked about. One of them is that my wife and I do counseling with them, and that's always done as a couple for us. And then secondly, this is going to sound odd. I'll explain it. There must be some form of a submission vow, like love, honor, and obey. And that is largely because when my wife and I got married, that was a huge heated debate between us. And one of the agreements we made when she conceded that, and it was because of the connotation of the word obey, by the way, not her unwillingness to submit. But one of the things as a result of that was that I would never do a funeral where that was left out because it would not be fair to my bride to do I said funeral, wedding. I would not do
I was about to call you on that.
Yeah, I would not do a wedding that did not include that, simply because it would be hypocritical and unfair to her. But yeah, how I always do counseling, I will tell you that in my first session, my wife and I have a thing that we do where, as one person who also does this described it, we intentionally try to break them up. And that's not mean-spirited, but if I can cause any friction in that relationship from the jump, where that doesn't seem like they really are ready for marriage, that gives us the opportunity to say, you guys aren't ready for marriage. I'm probably far more lenient on who I marry, but because I don't have a contract and those kind of things. But I do think you have to be careful. I will say that. I don't think that I am responsible if a marriage ends up in divorce.
That's not my rationale for it at all.
Yeah.
Like
I know some guys feel that way, but I don't agree with that.
Right. Just as much as God's not responsible for my sin, I would not be responsible for a marriage failing because I was the one who signed the paper.
Sure.
And to answer Hal's question, I absolutely require it if you want me to perform a wedding ceremony. The approach that I use is a hybrid where it will include study between the couple alone. Like they'll have their own work that they do independent of me. They'll meet with me and they will meet with Jill and I. I'm probably going to do one new thing that I haven't been doing and that's going to be requiring that the spouses meet individually with the husband to be meets with me, and the wife to be meets with Jill to talk about some things that I think are probably going to be easier to talk about when we're not in a co-ed context. I think that's probably going to be taking place with the next iteration that we end up doing of this, whenever that takes place. But we've always kind of had this expectation where, in the end, the last counseling session ends up at our dining room table with Jill making a meal. We sit down, we talk, because one, that's what Ken Dart did with us when Jill and I got married. And I just thought it was cool. But it's a great way to begin an illustration of what the marriage can look like, where you bring other people into your lives and you share your experiences with them, because that's kind of what marriage will end up affording the opportunity for them to do. So again, Hal, yes, absolutely. And I would not be comfortable doing a wedding without some counseling. Even if they had done 10 sessions with some great guy, I'm going to want to sit down with them and talk a little bit. I'm going to want to have a little conversation.
And I the only times that I've not done that, I will say, is when they're out of town, like in another state, and there's no way to do that. And I know that they're doing it with a friend of mine or somebody that I talk to. I have made that agreement before, but as a general rule, and I will tell you, every session happens at my house, and every session we feed them. So there's an added bonus to that, because I've never seen anybody turn down a meal. And like Phil, I think that shows a lot, a family interaction, a positive thing for them to see. And by the way, part of that, by the way, Hal, is weddings, like funerals. You have a responsibility, I think, to do the kind of service, like you said, you won't change the day up, but you need to know, you need to have met with them and talk about what they want. I always ask what kind of passages they want. And there's certain things I'm going to talk about that they don't get to take out, and we'll have conversations about that. But they have opportunity to give me things they want in there. And, that's part of our responsibility in this. And I think some preachers kind of get cavalier about this. We're evangelists, but these are two things that you're being asked to do as a favor to a family or to families. And it's a service you give. And, the reality is, it's not a worship service. It is certainly spiritual in nature, but a wedding's not a worship service. We break all kinds of rules about that if it was. And even a funeral is not a worship service. And so, again, I think so much of that is important, but absolutely I require counseling. In fact, in Tennessee, I don't think Alabama's this way. I even had people that would ask me to do counseling that I didn't do their weddings, because the state of Tennessee, if you live there and you don't know this, they give a huge discount to couples who go through a certain prescribed amount of counseling. I believe it's 4 hours last time I checked. Maybe it's 6. But and there's a list of people. You have to sign an affidavit and have it notarized. There's a list of people qualified, but clergy are one of those people. And I've done counseling for people who I didn't do their weddings because of that gave them, it took the price. Yeah, it took the price from $90 to $30. And I've had non-Christians ask me to do their counseling, which, by the way, is an amazing evangelistic opportunity. They're basically asking you, will you study the Bible with me? So, again, it's powerful. But, yeah, every time I do that.
Right, that kind of lends into we're kind of blending into our approaches area intentionally. We're not hopping from point to point here, but with goals set in mind, that we're trying to demonstrate for the funeral the goodness and severity of God in the appropriate way. For the wedding, you're really trying to do your very best to give the best stepping stones for a marriage that's just beginning. That's kind of your goals, and your approach is to try to figure out, how do I do that the best way? Another thing that we kind of have to grapple with is part of the small details. We're going to talk about outcomes in a second, but right here is where I'm going to insert a little bit of practical advice. Terry's got a few things probably in the same range. If you're nervous that you're not going to say the right thing, join the club. And here's one of the solutions. For a funeral or a wedding, I almost always, unless there's some reason that it doesn't work, have a manuscript that I prepared. of every single word I'm going to say from the second I step up to the second I get down. And depending on the theme of the environment, I have an old Bible to which I will stick my manuscript into. And so I'll have every single scripture printed out on the manuscript in an easy to read font, and I will tape it into the Bible itself and open up that Bible in sequence because I don't want to make a mistake at one of what very well could be one of the most important moments in a person's life. I don't reuse an outline. I don't like to say, well, I used this wedding outline 5 years ago and I'll just change the names as we go. I do not do that. I will print up everything new and do all of it new because it matters. I think that's a great way to kind of make sure that everything's perfect, especially when you forget things. So you have your Bible open, you're still reading the Bible because you've got it right there, but everything is sequentially lined out without any kind of stress. And every time you change a page, the next step is open. And yes, Adam Bernhardt, I do have a wedding spreadsheet. He just asked that question.
Well, let me say this. For my approach, first off, when I preach, I have not a manuscript, but I have everything written down in outline form, and I do mean word for word. So my outlines are rather long. And if you've ever asked for one, when you get it, usually people will go, "Oh, wow!" And that's just because I'm a severe planner on what I'm going to say. So I do the same thing with weddings and funerals. In funerals, I'll have my Bible and my iPad, and I'll use my iPad for my outline. That's always what I do when I preach. In weddings, I don't use my Bible, and I know that, but there's a reason for that. I put my outline all together, and I do it in a really nice paper, and I bind it, and I do that directly out of the wedding. And then after the wedding is over, I leave that on the gift table at the reception. I give the outline written down to the couple. Now, they can throw that away if they want to. That certainly is fine. But they would have a written copy, the copy I actually use. I usually write a note to them and put that and give that to them kind of as a memento of the day. And that's what happened at our wedding when Wilson Adams did it, and I continued to do that ever since. But I do think that these are serious occasions that even if you're kind of an ad-lib sermon guy, these are not ad-lib opportunities for you. These things need to be really well thought out.
For the most part, the brides have been thinking about their wedding since they were 2. And for the most part, the grooms have been thinking about their honeymoon since they were 11, 12, or 13.
Depending on when.
I'm just saying. So their level of anticipation is in the realm of at least a decade of being excited for this day. So don't drop the ball. Put the extra effort in that regard. And so there's a lot of other ways you can accomplish that same thing. I'll mention this: weddings in particular have been kind of shifting off the plate of preachers. Nothing wrong with that. I still end up doing premarital counseling, and then some relative does the actual ceremony. And honestly, I think I've done that more than I've done weddings if I think through my historical output side of like what I've done. But I think that's something to kind of keep in mind that, hey, you might just be serving as part of the team, and you get them to the goal line, and then somebody else whom they have a long make sure you. Could be on Terry's side too, but it'll fix itself in a second. But make sure you're licensed in the state that you are going to be performing the wedding that you're in. I have seen and know and talked to some Christians who had to sign paperwork 6 months later because their wedding paperwork was not accurate. So you'll definitely want to make sure that's the case.
Yeah, and some states are really lenient. Like basically in Tennessee, I think a dog can marry somebody. I mean, there's really when you call and check with the county, you don't
Right.
have to be quote unquote licensed. Now, if you go to Ohio, you have to actually have a license, and it takes a couple of months to get, unless they've changed that. Because I've done a wedding in Ohio, so you need to check into what the requirements are. That's a huge part of this. Some states require you to have a financial backer as a guarantor of you doing that, and that's kind of an
Mhm.
antiquated process as well. That you'll find most states are doing away with a lot of that stuff, which is also kind of a sign of just how little we value marriage to begin with, I'm afraid. But in most states, you don't even have to prove that you have the ability. You hear people being ordained all the time to do a wedding. That's not even required in most states that I'm aware of anymore. Um,
Yeah.
so
Just a few states still require that.
yeah, so check into
Um,
that and be careful to make sure you know what is needed
right.
on that aspect. You know, you talked about being a part of a team. I would say in regards to funerals, you are almost always part of a team. It is
Yeah.
very rare for you to do a funeral completely by yourself. Um, and sometimes if you don't communicate well, then you don't know what's going on. You know, one time I was asked to and by the way, people who talk to you don't always know. I learned this the hard way. I was asked one time to eulogize a member, and then later on, someone else is going to follow me and do what they call the sermon part. Well, for those who aren't familiar with those terms, when you think about eulogizing somebody, you think about remembering them. You think about
Mhm.
going through memories of their lifetime and their good qualities. And so I eulogized the person. Well, the person who got up after me says essentially, well, um, Terry said most of what I wanted to say. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, wait a minute, you know, and we had not discussed beforehand. I think I had called and it was one of these nonchalant kind of, hey, we'll just work it out. It'll be fine kind of moment.
Yeah.
And it really didn't work out fine. So um, you need to communicate in the process of that when you have multiple people involved. I was also at a funeral one time where the guy that led, not a funeral, a wedding where the guy that led the prayer um, essentially did the whole wedding service in the prayer
Yeah.
at the opening of the wedding service. And that's pretty interesting as well if you've ever had that to happen.
Yeah. Sometimes you want to make sure you highlight the skills that are the best for the job. When Jill and I were married, Jesse Flowers was selected as our closing prayer guy. And I think he had a sequence that summer where he had closed out like 8 weddings in a row. So he was on the ball. He was the best pick for the play that week. It made the team the best it could be. And sometimes you just kind of like making sure that that's the way it's going to go. You've got a lot of moving parts, and your goal is to reach a successful outcome. And that's kind of the
Yeah,
closing part for our conversation here. And a successful outcome for a funeral is the combination, again, of goodness and severity of God. That those who need to come and embrace the goodness of God, they can see it. And those who need to be reminded of the severity of God, they can feel it. Because you mentioned those who had fallen away. Sinners know they're sinning. They may be stubborn about it, but deep down they know that they're sinning. The ignorant are simply ignorant. And you can mention it and they can be inquiring, like, what do you mean by that? You mean what I'm doing is wrong? Um, they're going to feel any number of ways about it based on what they already know. So your job is to bring them in contact with the godly emotions of either godly sorrow or godly rejoicing. And so you're trying to really make that happen. So that's on the outcome on that side. An outcome of wedding is that the best steps are being made by that couple as they move forward. And so those are our outcomes that we're looking for. You don't have a lot of control over some of those things. You do have a tremendous amount of control about how you approach that outcome. Terry, you got any funny wedding stories you can drop in here? I know I didn't prep you with a chance to bring your comedy to play, and you need to have your manuscript out to get it all written out. But you can think about that for a second. Um,
well,
you know,
you know, the funniest people at any wedding are the ring bearer and the flower girl. You know, if you're a betting man, you're going to bet that one of them is going to mess it up.
yeah,
And that's just that's to be expected. That's really what they're there for. If you've not figured that out, as the comedic relief. I will tell you one thing. It's kind of funny, and I don't know if you've had this experience. I, I tell you what I hate the most about a wedding, just to people who've not been through it yet, is the rehearsal of the wedding. And here's why: because it is usually a train wreck, and the reason it's usually a train wreck is, for some reason, most people don't hire a wedding coordinator. They just have some friend who they think would be good at it. And that friend shows up and just kind of stands around, and you have this mass of people who don't know what's going on, and everybody's there. And it's probably 50% of the time you're sitting there and you're like, okay, and you sit around for 30 minutes talking, having a good time. Nothing's happened. And suddenly it's usually the mother of the groom who's paid for the meal says, we've got to be to eat in 45 minutes. So, I got to tell you, rehearsal is the worst part for me usually. And I'm at the point anymore where I go in and I ask if there's a wedding coordinator. If there's not a wedding coordinator, quite frankly, I just take over. If there's a wedding coordinator, I just say, okay.
That's your natural disposition anyway, Terry.
Yeah. I tell the wedding coordinator usually, you either keep this moving or I'm going to take over. And because quite frankly, there's not a lot to the rehearsal. I mean, anymore, especially, there's a lot less pomp and circumstance today with weddings. We figure out how fast you're supposed to walk, where you're supposed to stand. You can do that 2 or 3 times and you're done. Because I'm not going to rehearse what I'm going to say in front of you. We're just going to make sure all the moving parts know when to move. So it doesn't take long. Your wedding rehearsal is the most frustrating part because it takes like 3 times longer than it should because nobody's actually saying, we got to get this done. So that's one of those practical things outside the scope of what we were going to talk. So that's kind of really good.
I'll drop a couple things. One of the things that was hilarious to me was at a wedding a couple years ago. The preacher, not myself, that was viewing it. We get there, bride comes in, everyone stands, it's super awesome, everything's going great. The preacher we have the opening prayer, he begins to preach the actual sermon, everyone's still standing because he had forgot to say, everyone can take your seats. And everyone's still standing, looking at each other saying, who's going to be the first one to give in? And all the stubborn dudes are like, no, we're standing until he knows because this is going to be hilarious. Like, we knew that this was going to be a funny thing. And all the old people are like, quivering on their canes, wondering if the unnamed preacher, is doing this on purpose because the bride wanted it. Like halfway through the ceremony, he's like, he recognizes that everybody is still standing. Sit down, sit down.
That happened at my sister-in-law's wedding, and it was an older preacher, and he just forgot. And my wife was in the wedding, and other people. My wife was trying to signal to her mom to sit down because if the mother of the bride will sit down, everybody else will sit down. And my mother-in-law just kept standing. And it wasn't until like the vows were being taken that finally I got her attention, got her to sit down, and finally everybody could. But the preacher never realized he did it. And I was getting tired. I got to tell you, it was that was brutal.
Yeah, and so I mean, it's just and you look back on it, and it creates a unique memory. It makes that particular wedding stand out above all the others. Another wedding that I was at. It got rained out. It was supposed to be on a baseball diamond. The wedding was rained out, so they moved it into the rec hall nearby, which was where they were going to have my personal favorite for wedding food is potluck food. The food's always better at a potluck wedding. And so potluck food. And so that wedding.
I think I'm familiar with this wedding. I think I know who this is.
Yeah, that wedding, they had clowns going around and balloon animals. And the minister, at the close of the wedding, took the arms of the bride and the groom and held them up like they were victors at a WWE contest and said, bride and groom. And so if you want more details on that amazing wedding, not only do I have the memories, I have photographs of that wedding. And so
I got to tell you, the 2 weddings I remember most, one was just because it was amazing. It was down on Captiva Island on the beach. And that was awesome. And that was of a cousin of mine. The other wedding that I remember for the probably opposite reason the most was also a cousin of mine that was at a cemetery in a beautiful chapel. It was amazingly beautiful. It was I think it was in August, and it was 98 degrees, and there was no air conditioning. and I have never sweat like I sweat that day.
Yeah.
And so I remember both of those pretty well. Um,
Right. I'll add this
Pretty interesting.
bonus tidbit. If you want to make it a successful wedding event, bring some Gatorade and a little bit of food for the bride and the groom. They will get dehydrated. The groom may not actually have access to the food that's supposed to be there for them, and so that keeps them from passing out during the ceremony. There's a lot of other practical tips you can read in books about that stuff, but I think it's really important to come prepared for a successful event, just like anything else.
Yeah.
Except this one, the stress level is probably through the roof for everybody. Mothers of the bride, mothers of the groom, and so on are all freaking out because they've been planning for it since the day their child was born.
Well,
Any last
and
things?
along that lines, everybody's freaking out except you need to be the one guy that's not. You need to be the
Yeah,
guy that's, I'll tell them all the time. Something goes wrong, I'm like, hey, look, it's okay. You're going to leave here married today, regardless of how this looks. And in a
yeah,
couple of years, you're going to look back on it. You're going to laugh about it. These are going to be good memories. You think they're not now, but it's all going to be okay. You just need to be reassuring to them. You've got to be that one person that doesn't get anxious. If it looks like it's going to rain at the outside wedding, then, you be the voice of reason. You be calm because nobody else is going to be calm. And I think that's a huge part of that.
right. You're not going to be sitting every single day between the date of your wedding until whenever, watching the videos from the wedding over and over again. They're important. They're significant. They may not be Brett Culp level of significance, who's a wedding photographer, filmographer that we both know, who does amazing work. Not to discredit his stuff, but most of those wedding videos and photos aren't to that quality, not to the quality he can produce. So probably not going to watch them every day, but you're going to watch your spouse every day. You're going to see
Yeah.
that relationship grow every day, and that's really what the outcome is. That you're giving this newly formed home a great start. So as we've talked before, if you guys have questions about particulars of weddings and funerals, give us a drop online, send a message to us. By the way, if you're near a funeral home and you preach, go talk to them and ask for a preacher's tour, because they will let you in and understand things better. They want to work well with you. They want to provide a great service to their clients, and you're part of that process, and you need to know how they do things. They will love to show off their system and their methodology and to work with you better. I toured one as a young guy with Johnny Edwards. We even saw the underside of things and the mechanical stuff of how they went about it. Go check it out. Learn so it's not weird, because people will also ask you questions about it. Like, how's it go? Well, this is how it goes, and you can step them through it, especially if you're a younger guy.
Yeah. Make good friends with your funeral director. Another practical tip,
Yeah,
because they're kind of your lifeline, and they'll tell you if you don't know. They'll tell you where to stand. They'll tell you where to go, and
yeah.
don't be
They
afraid
give you
if you
those
don't know what to
spots.
do. Yeah, don't be afraid if you don't know what to do. Just say, hey, look, I've not done this before. I need some help,
Right.
and tell those guys. They're great people. And one of the guys in Memphis was actually a regional manager over 4 funeral homes. He was a great asset, man, to people who lost
Yeah,
people, and just get to know those guys. They're a tremendous asset in a funeral weekend for sure.
yeah. And I always like to make it personal. I'll take them out to lunch and talk to them. Say, hey, let's go to lunch one day. I really want to know how to do this part of my work better. And you do this
Yeah,
for a living. So that means you're doing this much more than I am. So share some
yeah.
resources, share some insight, build a relationship that's stronger. But again, we'll be back again next Tuesday talking about stuff. I think we might try to throw in some things about preparing kids for college, preparing kids for school from the preacher's standpoint. It seems pretty relevant for us to talk about that because both of our children will be embarking on the first or second year of college, and they already have started their high school and middle school and all that stuff yet. So might be we see some good insight there, and we talk about what about the preacher and life transitions, and we'll start with one of those being going to college. So maybe we can talk about some successes and mistakes in that realm. Terry, last shot's yours.
Oh, I was just thinking about what you said about next week. I'll just say this: your son's a freshman, so that means you and your wife are struggling with that. My son's a sophomore. We can't wait for him to leave, but we'll talk more about that next
It'll be a great conversation, I'm sure. Take care,
week. Yeah.
everybody. Praying for your successes.